11 Days of Remembrance, Day 11. Chapter 13, The Road Home. Larry was finally notified that he was to return home on the Ile-de-France at, six, at 63,000 tons. This amazing ship was the third largest troop ship in the fleet and rolled like a cork. All the enlistees were assigned to a table for meals. One the first day there was 8 men at his table and a pride who sat across from him. The next morning there were 3 men present, and on the third day it was just the pride and Larry. "I guess you don't get seasick?" the pride said, placing his napkin slowly in his lap. Larry didn't say anything. He just smiled as he remembered how he and his crewmates tore through the sky with 2 pilots who flew the heavy Lancasters like fighter jets, corkscrewing and diving in the often pitch-black night air. At midnight, a bit tough and rolling around on that old tub, he thought, like a mouth on a flame. Larry saw out the poker games on the board, and he was not eating or sleeping. He was playing cards, usually holding all the aces. When the ship eventually docked in Halifax, Larry boarded a train for Ottawa, where he would be processed and reassigned. Apparently, Larry's record had preceded him, because the powers that be realized he was suffering from battle fatigue and told him to go home and await reassignment. Larry got out of at the taxi at the foot of the driveway to the old family farm. It was a typical Nova Scotia winter, and the driveway was covered with 5 centimeters of snow. The biting air chewed at his face, but Larry was finally home. He closed the car door and was about to make way up the long driveway when he heard a familiar sound. He squatted into the bright eastern sunshine to see the best friend in the world, his dog Corky, a Boston Terrier, who was barking his way up the driveway. Larry choked back a huge lump in his throat as he realized the little dog had not forgotten him. Corky went ballistic, barking, spinning his circles, and making high-speed passes around the house. He got in 3 complete passes in before Larry was to gather him into his arms and hug him. Larry's dad, Jim Sutherland, came to the back door to meet him. It was a meeting of 2 Sonic Scots. No big hugs, no big wet kisses on the forehead, just a "hello, son." "Hello, Dad," followed by, "You were busy over there, son." Their response was a simple "Yes, yes, I was." As Larry evaluated his old home, everything around him seemed surreal. It was like a century ago he was here, but in fact it had been only a few short years since it had left his farm. He was finding it very difficult to deal with all the conflicting emotions and covering experiences. There was really no way to accept a plan others than recruiting nightmares of fighters sneaking out of the black void and flak shooting at him from the dark recesses of his mind became exhausting. He saw the empty chairs in the mess hall the morning after every raid and a vivid slideshow of very dear friends who were now gone forever. As almost overwhelming feeling of gut came over him, it was very confusing time. Larry continued to wear his uniform. He had been promoted to the rank of flying officer, and he was awaiting his new assignment. In the meantime, he tried to remain busy and get out effort and to deal with his demons. His brother John, stationed at the Burt base, came home to be with the family for a couple of days before being deployed overseas. "You were in uniform a year ahead of me," he said one morning as the two brothers sat quietly together. "I remember you gave me a hard time for not getting suit up and being over there, and I am now back home after having done my tour of duty and you just pulling out." The moment added to Larry's growing anxiety about his future. The Canadian federal election of 1945 gave Larry an opportunity to work with the retiring officers in a polling station on the Burt military base. Larry was crossing names off the list of eligible voters who he was approached by a pilot who noticed Larry's wings. "Are you a pilot?" he asked. "No, I was an air gunner," Larry replied proudly. "Well, seeing as you are already here, are you up for a little excitement? I fly mosquitoes. I can take you up for a flight." Larry simply replied, "No, thank you. I had all the excitement I needed for a little while." Chapter 14. East Mountain, Nova Scotia. During his service overseas, Larry had sent home most of his pay because he believed his father needed it to make ends meet on the farm. The bulk of Larry's day-to-day needs were met by the service, not to mention what he made on the occasion back market transactions or snooker poker game. In fact, Larry returned from service with over $1,000 in his pocket. Larry's father surprised him one day by mentioning that he had kept the money Larry had sent home over the years, just over $1,000. He asked Larry if he would like to have it back. Larry told him to keep it, although $1,000 was a considerable sum in those days. A few years later, however, when Larry was in the hospital in Toronto for a month and almost lost his house, having to sell his truck to survive, he would think of that $1,000. As it approached that Larry was not going anywhere anytime soon, he decided to have his nose fixed. Since he broke it early in the war when Doug Smith dropped the tail of the runway, Larry had problems breathing properly. When he was admitted to Camp Hill Hospital in Halifax, he was thrilled to find out he would be sharing a room with Squadron Leader George Uphart Hill, one of Canada's most famous aces and recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, and two bars and representative of the two young men were sitting in a room 109, both in their mid-20s and both decorated aces. One an air gunner who had won the DFC twice, the other a fighter pilot ace who had been awarded the DFC 3 times. What had happened in their short lives was more than most people would experience in 2 lifetimes. But it was stood the former employer had no need for their service, and they were among hundreds of thousands of North American men returning home with hunks of metal joining their chests. With George asked Larry what he wanted to do now that he was home, Larry realized he couldn't answer him truthfully. He really didn't know. George, on the other hand, had aspirations to become a doctor, and he graduated from Dalhousie University Medical School in 1950. After being promoted to flying officer on November 2, 1944, Larry took his released from the RCAF on February 9, 1945. Won the honor of being the top Canadian air gunner in Bomber Command. He knocked around for a year at odd jobs until he discovered that Air Force was photographing and mapping Canada's north. Larry had always been interested in northern Canada and in photography, so he decided he wanted to be part of that project. Chapter 15. Back into Service. Larry re-enlisted in the RCF on June 27, 1946. He could not retain his wartime rank of flying officer, but re-enlisted as a leading aircraftman. They gave Larry his complete medal file to take to Ottawa with him, and naturally anyone in his position would read it. It was information. After all, he felt he had a, a right to view it. The file was quite general, including the diagnosis of his eye condition. What really irked Larry was a statement by one of his physicians possessing records for aircrew. In his opinion, Larry was not aggressive enough to become an air gunner. Larry felt his judgment was made by someone whose greatest peril during the war was to trip and fall, owning the bar at the Halifax Yacht Club. Larry went to study photography at Number One Photo Establishment in Ottawa. He had a very difficult time dealing with the peacetime Air Force, and he felt he was consistently being stonewalled, and it would come to getting his career in actual photography started. At one point, a newly minded peacetime NCO felt it was his duty to whip this bumpkin into shape and ordered Larry to scrub the barracks floor each morning prior to leaving for classes. Larry found the level of bureaucracy absolutely mind-numbing. He made the decision that a second military career was not for him. 2 days before leaving the Air Force for a second time, Larry was invited to go across the bridge to a nightclub in Hull, Quebec. He met a buddy there who introduced him to a attractive young lady, and during the course of the evening, he and the young woman stepped outside to have a cigarette. They were long when a huge sailor came through the door, angry at the world and letting everyone know it. He was using every foul explosion he could, his tongue, too. Larry was not to be intimidated and promptly told him to watch his language, but the comment was like waving a red flag in the face of an angry bull, and it naturally gave the huge sailor something to focus his anger on. He came at Larry swinging. Larry stood 6 feet tall, and after he blocked two punches from his guy, he had to punch up to hit him, which he did, squarely on the end of the nose. The blow must have interrupted a major blood vessel because blood came spewing out of the giant nose like a fire hose fixed on five-story building. It's the exact instinct of sailor's body, almost as big as a salt himself, came through the door, but to Larry's good fortune it was more concerned with his friend than Larry. Larry's lady friend, however, was rather upset with him. She did not feel like he shouldn't have hit the sailor. Larry, on the other hand, did feel he should let the giant beat on him. He returned to the nightclub, went directly to the washroom, and from there crept out the window into a snowdrift, returning to the base. It wouldn't do to get through into a big for 2 days before leaving the Air Force for the second time. The very next day in Ottawa, Larry was walking down a street to pick up some photos, and approaching him from the opposite direction was the swinging giant with some sort of apparatus attached to his nose. Larry nervously pulled his hat down over his eyes and crossed to the other side of the street. On December 16, 1946, he took his release and once again became a civilian. Chapter 16. Getting On with Life. Newly unemployed Larry took a train to Toronto to find work. He, as he walked through a main entrance of Union Station, he noticed a large re- restaurant directly across the street with a sign in the window that read, "Help Wanted." Larry applied at Mary's restaurant and accepted as a dishwasher. Mary, it seemed, was very popular. On one occasion, they served 1,000 people in a single day. Larry found he was occasionally going flat out just to keep up with the flow of dishes. One day, through really got out of him. The kitchen staff couldn't keep up with the food orders. "Can you cook?" Larry turned around, his arms elbow high and dirty dishes, to see the manager standing behind him. Anything he had to be better than washing dishes, so he said he could, when he might be a little over his head, but that the hell, but couldn't be that difficult. To this day, Larry still loves to cook. While working at Mary's, Larry would meet the love of his life, Margaret Purrier. Larry and Margaret would stay together until her death in February of 2009. From time to time, Larry was pressed into duty out front serving coffee to the people waiting for a table to open up. One day he was serving coffee. From behind him, a man asked, "What the hell are you doing here?" Larry turned and almost dropped a coffee pot. He was looking at a ghost, a man he had given up for dead, a man he had breathed for, Christopher Columbus. Christopher was presumed dead because his name had never appeared on any of the Red Cross's rosters as having been a prisoner of war. The only reply Larry could think of was, "Mankey, your damn meal is what I'm doing." The Empress sat down and sat up. Christopher had been shot down in January 1944 and had spent the rest of the war moving and fighting with the French Marquis. Larry felt good to be working, but the food business did not pay well. One day, on his way home from work, he passed by a construction project and he saw a man laying bricks. Larry asked him what the job paid. It was a hell of a lot more than slugging hash, so he set a goal to find a job in the industry. He took every courses in basic construction, and Larry was given a bunch of bricks that had been put on a basement of a house he lived in, and he began to practice. On the weekends, he would roam around until he found a construction site. Then he would ask the foreman, "Who is your best bricklayer?" Eventually, they would point to him in the direction of the courtesy of old fellow. Larry would stand there and watch him before going home to practice. Eventually, he worked up the courage to apply for a job. The foreman looked at Gus skeptical, so he took him over to a wall to see what Larry could do. Obviously, it was enough because he got the job. One of the most challenging jobs Larry had was working on the Toronto subway as a construction foreman. As Larry was journeying along the job site, one morning he approached a group of carpenters. One of them turned towards him, and Larry did a double take. It was like looking at another ghost. Standing there was his ghost friend, Mike McKinnon. Like Christopher Columbus, Mike had been presumed dead. He too was with the underground fighters in France for some time, moving from group to group. He gradually made his way through France and over the mountains to Spain, where he was able to ship out from Lisbon, where being into it seemed to surreal that these two men would have shared so much together. He had little time for words. The fog of war had dispatched, and each was just trying to get on with life. Mike explained to Larry that he was living, leaving for New York the next day to work as a carpenter, and that was the last time Larry ever saw him. Toronto, 1947. Larry had refused an invitation to go to Buckingham Palace to receive his medals. As a result, he was a civilian before he was mainly positioned with the DFO and bar. Frank Larry Lawson, the Ontario Lieutenant Governor, would award the medals. Larry's cousin Jack Christian Jr. was sitting at a couple rows back from the podium. The people that sat the agenda for the press education had listed Larry's rank as LAC, which was the lowest and the last rank he had in the service. They would basically unaware that he enlisted as a flying officer, and the DFC and BAR were presumed the LAC clearance. Bentley Sutherland. Jack was seated behind a couple, and over the wife she turned to the husband and said, "An LAC receiving the DSC and bar." The husband, clearly being very knowledgeable in the situation, explained, "He, the announcer, must have screwed up. The Sutherlands are very tough and a double breed. Larry just blew it off. It didn't matter to them. He thought that it shouldn't have mattered to him. He went home and tossed the ribbons in the drawer of a little hall table just inside the entryway. His sister Maureen was nuts when she went to visit and found her niece and nephew playing with the decorations on the floor. They were eventually lost. Ross McIntosh would years later and after a few drinks tell Larry that his medal presentation was and went to Graham Palace for did not hear much better. About 300 of us were waiting in the great lineup, and orchestra was playing. You noticed along with your sixth line at the time. Franklin stepped forward and put what looked like a meat hook in your pocket to hold the medals. As over Hickman, the instrument instructed us not to shake the king's hand too gracefully because the king was seeing several hundred people that day. He continued with, "I finally approached the king. I was a little taken back because the king was just a little guy and appeared to have rogue on the face. He did not look well at all." The king said, "Well done, and we are on our way." Just around the corner and out of sight, another flickering appeared to take the meat hook and put the medals in a little box. After that it was out the door, and on one photographer was taking the picture. McIntosh looked Larry dead in the eyes. "Larry, if I had known that it was going to be it, I would have hit the royal blue and grabbed a couple sheets of royal toilet paper for a souvenir," he, he said, laughing. Toronto, 1954. Larry developed a severe stomach ailment. He began hurrying to the point that he nearly died. His sister Miriam came from the Maritimes to help out so he would recover. There was no medical insurance in those days, and by the time Larry was well again, he was put down, well down to the boot scraps. Finally, he had to sell his truck and was in a position where he could lose his house. Once again, he had to go where the money was. Larry looked at the U.S. where the wages in the construction were much higher. At 55, Larry moved to the Chicago area and joined the bricklaying union. Over the next number of years, he worked on many major projects and met many people. One of these projects, he met a German by the name Hans Wickel, who was working as a mason. The two would often spend time talking, but whenever the conversation turned to the war, and particularly the Air Force, Vicken would become withdrawn, which made Larry curious about Heinz. Years later, Larry did some research into Heinz. He discovered a German ace called Heinz Vicken had claimed 54 kills at the night he tried to locate people in the Chicago area in hopes of determining if Heinz Wickel was in fact a famous German ace, but he never got an answer. He did some more research and eventually found a write-up wartime photo. On February 26, 1944, Wickel was shot down over the English Channel by RAF fighters while searching for one of his comrades. Wickham was in the company of another Bf-109 piloted by Lieutenant Royland, who managed to escape the RAF fighters. Larry spent a lot of time looking at photos from the period and believed it that he had worked with the ace who will ever know of for sure. Germans immigrated to the U.S. shortly after the war. We were very vague on considering their wartime service for good reasons. The injury most common to bricklayers to the back, and Larry was no exception. During the time he was laid up, he scratched for another employment that did not require construction, being and lifting, and from employment as agency that would describe to today standards as temp agency or headhunters. Larry threw himself into the job, would gusto and worked the dead flies. These were files on people that applied to be placed or replaced. Larry would phone them and ask if they were employed or if they are happy with their present employment. He worked the other end of the placement business by contacting the personal aisles all over the U.S. long after employments were home. As a result, placed many professionals over the country. Larry had acquired a large manufacturing company in the Chicago area, metal engineer with a very particular skills. Larry turned to his dead file and a contact a man living in Nebraska who he knew he had the skills he required, asking him could be a Chicago appointment at 6 p.m. the following day. But Larry didn't know as the engineer was very short on cost and he didn't have the money for airfare, but he did have just enough to fuel the little Cessna he was planning, trying to hang into. Well, before dawn, he took off a flight to Chicago. On the way, he encountered strong headwinds, ran low on fuel 20 miles west of Chicago, and had to set down in a farmer's field. He paid the farmer to run him into Chicago, and he made his appointment on time. The next morning, the vice president of the manufacturing company contacted Larry and said, "One hell of a guy you sent me. I hired him. Anyone that went through what he did to make an interview on time, it's amazing at determination." Larry would eventually leave the company and spend more time good. In the spring of 1985, Larry received a phone call from Martin Mutterbrook, who described himself as a farmer who liked to write. Martin was working on a book called The Berlin Raids, and he wanted Larry's perspective of the events. Martin and Larry had several conversations, and Martin's book turned out to be one of the best books written on the subject. Martin sent him a copy of the Berlin raids with the inspiration for Larry Sutherland, who flew 9 of the Berlin raids as an air gunner. Best wishes. However, Larry was quite put out to the raid with a book description of the night of December 24th, 1943. It read, "One night fighter was itself shot down over Berlin, probably hit by Warrant Officer Fudge." Nevertheless, Martin inspired Larry, and he began to reach out to other air gunners. He became involved in the Air Gunners Association and wrote a few articles for various publications. Larry retired in 1992 and moved to Silverton, Florida. He was left with his memories, and throughout his short-term memory often fails him. Events that happened 60 years ago are as fresh to him as the scent of fresh Mayflowers in spring. Starting in 2001, Larry began to receive calls from other authors in England via Roth writing a book about the life and times of Wallace McIntosh that he was going to call Air Gunners. Another author and in 2003 received his copy of the book instead to clearance as a Top Gun. Mary, thanks for your help. Larry read the book and was totally devastated. The action described during the encounter and settling down of the night fighters on the mission was strictly different than the way it actually happened. Larry was the first to see all 3 fighters that night. The other, perhaps because of artistic license, gave credit for the sighting of the final night fighter to the wireless operator who spotted it on the monitor. There were only the monitor. McIntosh, he told Larry he was vulnerable of the curse record or debunked it. Larry had extended his hospitality to the man for many years and introduced him to the crew members of the first crew who extended their hospitality to him in kind. Larry felt the time before the book was published. Chapter 17. The Beaches of Normandy. June 6, 2004. Larry was made aware of the 60th D-Day reunion and made the decision to take part in the ceremony marking the landing on the beaches of Normandy. He had enough time to obtain reservation of the original decorations plan. Once Larry was in the morning, June 6, Southern D-Day. Yes, I was. I was a mid-upper gunner in the day to which 1,000-pound bombs, German tank construction here. He then added a home Lancaster short was an ME 410. My goodness, I must get a grandson and get a photo of you both, she replied. They talked for a while about where he grew up, and he had been going since the war. He found her to be wonderful. She a caring person, was thrilled by the experience. A short time later, Canadian D-Day veterans were assumed within a group a photo to see Arnold Betty, the rear gunner on the operation flight. It was hearing to see so many others lived and had fully lived after experience such a tumultuous time. The majority of surviving the veterans of the Second World War are now in their late 80s. As time marches on, their stories will be lost unless they experience are documented somehow. Like many veterans, Larry has hoped and dreamed that their conflict would be their last. He hoped that the incredible sacrifices of the best of their youth would make a better world for us all. Today, Larry's memories of the great adventure are as sharp and clear as ever. His favorite expression is still, "Watch out for the night fighters." When you received commission from him, you can find his phrase written in very small script just under the flap of the envelope as you open it, or just between the lines of the letter. Through the scenes the Reverend, he has an unforgettable sense of humor. It is the Andre Pro that taken the one-eyed gunner as decorated man as extraordinary journey. Notes: Bill Baker. Bill immigrated to Canada and became a tourist in the 1980s. Rudolph Frank. Two crew members of the Ju-88 Larry St. Blaze, December 23rd, before 1940 bailed out. The tail gunner was killed instantly, but the pilot Rudolph Frank survived a flight with 45 bombers he filled that night. During the late 90s, Larry expressed a desire to try and locate Frank and perhaps speak to him. I had a friend in West Germany, Major John Gray, British Army retired. John researched through the German equivalent of Larry's Air Gunners Association and the lawyer and lesbian Frank. His dad was quite ill and was hospitalized. He would tell his father that Larry had called. Don Thomas. During the summer 1980, Larry met with officer Jack Thomas, current December 24th, 1943, and perhaps the High Grant. Larry Carriage. The Orphans of Smith Career. Doug Smith, pilot Doug Smith, lives in New Zealand. Larry fondly refers to him as the direct farmer in New Zealand. A few years ago, before landing in, he asked by a stewardess if she was his first trip to New Zealand, and Larry said it was. She inquired if the trip was business or vacation. Larry answered, "No, I have come to visit a pilot I served with in Bomber Command during the Second World War, Doug Smith." The stewardess replied, "Doug's son is one of our captains, and I have flown with him many times." Doug spent his whole working career as a commercial pilot and ended his career with a phenomenal record of 83,000 hours in flight books. On March 5th, 2010, I phoned Doug overseas, and a 92-year-old 87, Doug gave up to Larry McCarthy, wireless operator. As a duck and home operator. Larry President operator. Harry President Alex White, mid-upper gunner, head of for him was a subset. The last crew Larry flew with. John Gray, pilot. John Gray spent the remainder of his working career with the air industry. John was older than the rest of the crew, had been around 33 or 36 years old at the time. It was then air ministry, gallant major, and when war ended, Gallant was taken POW, held for 2 years. After his release in 1947, he lived in northern Germany. Karl for and the Argentine government in 1948. In 1954, Harriet and Northern John Gray died on March 21st, 1961, at the age of 48. Bob Cook, bombardier. Bob is still living, registered in southern part of England. After the war, he trained to become a doctor. He now retired. Tommy Lynn, flight engineer. The group was not able to contact Tommy after the war ended. Bob Jack, wireless operator. Bob became one of the foreigners in the computer business, running in the area for many years. Larry was not able to make any contact with Bob Jack. He passed away in 1964. Hip Hall navigator. Hip was still living. Hip found 4 air ministries for the rest of his career. Wallace Rockendoss Gunner. Wallace was established after return orphans crew Larry the best. They say there's a Lancaster out on the field, waiting to go on a flight. With hydraulics leaking and engine revs down, however that light, there was one or two cylinders running a tap. The rudders held down by a fin with other consortium. We're hoping to get to Berlin. The pilot, Doug Smith, from Auckland, can come down the bombardier as days of her. Harry Pusher, as a flight engineer, and the American Dorothy as a flight, the St. Helen. I think we better be on the track or we wind up in the drink. Ron Peter is the wireless operator with the DAS and dart, and he turned into the crowds with a rifle. Manning the upper gun, my friend Alex White, and giving the Krauts a really good fight. I have to say, no ands or buts to Red so Sutherland's in the rear, that bloody Canuck. He will see the fighters if we have any luck. Over the fighters, over the road. We should have the flag. Out our flag. Our flag. When we started, we're out. There's the lives. During the 207th reunion, I shot through the nose. It should have been a pleasure flying by your boys. CB, there's Sentiment, 207th Squadron. Surface, presents, several trainer. That is the end of the book and the end of 11 Days of Remembrance. I thank the veterans who fought in World War I and World War II for what they did, so I can do my videos, I can go on Zoom. I thank them for that, and I can make videos, I can walk, I can think to myself, I have free thoughts, and that I can go to polling stations and do it safely, and I thank their sacrifice that they did. And if you want to know what the book I read, it was this, The One-Eyed Gunner. And thank you to the veterans for what you have done. And I thank my great-grandfather, Roly MacArthur, for fighting in World War I, got shrapnel in his butt so I could be free. And I thank my cousin who fought in the Battle of Britain. Unfortunately, he died, but he died for my freedom, so I thank him for that. And I thank my great-uncle Ted Diebel for defending the Halifax Harbor from the German U-boats and doing the early submarine warfare. I thank him for that, so I could be free and I could walk and travel anytime I want to be free. And this year, you really have to thank them because we're making our own sacrifices right now for the pandemic. What they had to do was they had to do it for 5 years. And I thank them for what they did so I could be free, so I can make my videos. Thank you, and be kind to the veterans, and be a friend to them, because they have lost a lot of friends.